I've spent a lot of the last 12 months looking at how we can explore and develop and bring into the heart of our enterprise and into the enterprises of our clients this concept of responsible AI. And when I talk about responsible AI, I'm talking about that transparency, fairness, honesty, that accountability and human centricity that we believe as we develop AI technology for our clients and work alongside clients who are exploring the technology, that they have to have first and foremost in their minds before they even get to the scope of how do you build and take the opportunity that the technology brings. So my prediction is this wave of talk that we're hearing about responsible data use, responsible AI, is going to really merge and become a real theme around responsible business. And frankly, that's one that my organization is absolutely talking to our clients about and really seeing as a key differentiator in the way in which we do business. Now, I need to bring that to bear in the context of GDPR. And really, you know, as an in-house lawyer, I'm opting to take, I think, what is my right, which is to focus less on the technicalities of the law and more on the pragmatic and commercial application of it in industry, and therefore to try and apply a slightly different lens. And you know, I bring this from the view of our lawyers within Accenture, but also from our professionals who are advising companies in this space of GDPR compliance and how to make their use and use of data a trusted use of data for their clients. So I'm not going to start with the legislation. I'm going to start with this issue of digital trust because we truly believe we are at an inflection point in society around this question of trust. Now, of course, trust is an inherent implication of GDPR. It is why the building blocks of GDPR exist as they do to help create a foundation of trust. But in essence, what companies need to care about, what we hear our clients talk about, is that without trust, customers and consumers will vote with their feet and they'll take their wallets with them. The choice that a company has is to see building trust as an opportunity and to see actually GDPR as helping shape that opportunity. Now, we know there's no choice but to implement. If you're a corporate, you have to comply. But that mindset of an opportunity, I think, is the fundamental difference as to how we pursue this key opportunity. And frankly, success absolutely, measurably comes from trust. Now, I'll show more about that in a moment. But I think it's important to think about, oops, I've gone too far. Why now? You know, this issue of trust isn't new. You know, it's been a matter of human interaction over time. It's true that there's something being amplified now. It's the digitization of our transactions, the fragmentation of our relationships, the vast vapor trails of data that we're creating. And it's not that we've got some sort of snowflake generation who somehow just doesn't trust corporates, government, and institutions more. It's that something is being amplified because something is changing in the way that we are relating and work together. Now, you may well ask in the context of these types of questions, you know, should a wise consumer really trust anyone? But I don't think that that is realistic. And I think that businesses really do have it in their DNA to want to be trusted and liked by their consumers. And pragmatically, it is an enormous prize if they can achieve that. Now, I'm going to avoid, to some extent, in the limited time available, the subject of cybersecurity, which in and of itself is an entire subject, which would fill another day, but is critical to this issue of trust, because no doubt the emergence of these cyber breaches are things that are driving this consumer concern around the lack of trust. And how do we know that this is, you know, an opportunity? How do we know that there's value in this for business and therefore it will make a decision, rather, it'll make a difference to the decisions made by businesses? So we've recently done some research in a report called A Slice of Pie with a Side of Digital Trust. An American must have been involved in naming that in any event. And you know, what we're looking at there is, you know, the huge vapor trails that we are all leaving behind us, irrespective of whether you're on one particular platform or another. If you've got a mobile phone, a smartphone in your pocket these days, congratulations, you are busy leaving a vapor trail as you move around the city. But I think what our research confirmed is what I would hope you would guess, and that is that value can be created and destroyed in a corporate setting if we do not attend to the question of trust. So companies that use care in how they hold the data and what they do with it, those that think about there being a return on investment to consumers, either because it's by levels of service that can be received or by choices that can be made by the consumer around who has access to their data and how their data is future used, that return on investment, including in the way in which issues that might arise being dealt with really swiftly, that helps avoid customer churn, and it sees faster and higher adoptions of platforms and services by consumers. There's your business imperative. I'd like to think that this was all being driven by GDPR, but the reality is GDPR is a very helpful tool, and it should be seen as such. But really the business imperative must be around trust. So I don't think this is just about the legislation. I absolutely agree with Elizabeth that the legislation provides power. And as a consumer, I'm delighted that we have strong regulators who can enforce the regulatory position. But my argument to you is, as businesses, we must take greater responsibility for the data that we use, and that responsibility is about decisions we make in how we use the data. So if we're at this inflection point, which we believe we are, this question of digital ethics and responsible data must be the response to that question of trust. So clearly GDPR makes its contribution to that journey. But I'd like to tell a little story about how we got it a little bit wrong, as a way of sort of giving an example of how just because it's legally permissible to do something doesn't mean you should do it. Now it's, you know, I'd like to start by saying it all happened in the US, Elizabeth, so nothing to worry about here. We went to an event. Accenture sponsored an event, a bit like today, except this event was a party. It was a party associated with a conference called South by Southwest. Some of you may know it, which is for technologists, people in the interactive marketing environment, people who you would think would be very fascinated by and interested in the use of AI technology. And at this splashy event, the kind of cool event that I'm afraid I don't get to go to, possibly I'm too old and not quite in the target market. At this event, we had Party Bot. You walk in, you can see a little video telling you what the bot's going to do. It uses facial recognition, voice technology to gauge my mood, how I'm feeling. It asks me questions and about what music I'd like to hear played at the party. And by participating, I'm given the opportunity to, by answering a quiz, earn some swag that I can take home with me. I'm given an opportunity to access parts of the party that I wouldn't if I didn't go in. I'm given the opportunity to, you know, to have my music, my preferred music, played at the venue. Now, we obtained consent, we had it legally reviewed before the technology was implemented. All sounds okay so far? If you weren't consenting, your faces weren't being, you know, recognised around the venue, nothing like that. And yet, the reaction to this technology amongst people who are designing and building this technology for others it was creepy, right? Our intent, clearly, was to give people a nice party. You know, enthuse them with, you know, meeting their needs, gauging, using technology. But the attempt to get in their head was seen as truly creepy and a problem. Now, you know, Jonathan makes a good point. This reminder that, you know, data protection laws emanate in part, you know, some of the earliest laws, from the sense that the state was attempting to intervene in our lives. Fundamentally, that's what drives the GDPR issues that we have today. And so, you know, I would say that, you know, the Labour Party, for example, having raised amendments to the UK Data Privacy Bill to link the bill to the EU Fundamental Rights Charter is just another example of us recognising that as corporations we can't forget that although there may be assets and there may be value in the data sets, we have to understand that the data subject behind the data is also a person with fundamental rights and ownership of their own data. And I think that's something that, as technologists, we need to think more about the people behind the data. It is very easy to get it wrong in your enthusiasm to explore the technology. So if I talk about these moments of trust in a customer journey, you know, it's not just about the box-ticking exercises of ensuring we have the artifacts of compliance in our program to make sure that we are complying and able to demonstrate our compliance and accountability. But we have to step back and ask ourselves from the perspective of the consumer that these moments that matter in terms of building trust are as much accounted for as any of the programs and infrastructure that Jonathan talked about in how at the back end we're enabling compliance. Now, Jonathan talked about some of the complexity for corporates, particularly multinationals, in addressing not only GDPR and making that make sense globally, but actually addressing emerging types of laws. So in India, the Supreme Court case that has led to a recommendation that we should have legislation there because of this sense of human rights. Or Brazil, where this concern about globalization and the impact on their economy driving to particular concerns around how data transfer is handled. Or indeed, the laws in China around how we're looking at data, and really it's less about protection of the individual, I would posit, than it is about control of the state and that ability to drive control of the data. If you're a global company and you're trying to operate in all of these places, marry these things and also touch the consumer, that to me is one of the challenges of operating in the modern environment. Now, I think there was a question asked earlier about the cost associated. I always love when there's a transition on a slide, don't you? The cost and the burden. And again, you know, they're very significant costs. Some of the numbers here were from surveys conducted some time ago. And it's true that there are costs of compliance. I think there's a genuine question about, you know, for a business like Accenture, for whom data is at the heart of our business, this is a necessary cost of business and one that we think provides an opportunity and one where we provide our clients with the view that they too have opportunities. But if you're a small to medium enterprise and you're trying to operate in the same environment, it's not clear to me that the costs of compliance deliver quite the opportunity and quite the return on investment. Now, compliance with laws aren't about return on investment always, but I do think that there is an opportunity for us to think, as we give guidance to organisations about how they comply, to think about the way in which we can make that an incentivised opportunity for them to comply by really looking at risk-based assessments and how accountability is really part of the model of compliance. But I'm not going to focus on SME. So if I look at some of the issues here, you know, clearly, you know, what's driving this sense of burden are perhaps issues around, you know, tighter restrictions around consent. We've heard about the need to appoint data privacy officers if you're processing at scale, the need to report incidents at speed, the need to be able to give people all of their personal data if they request it, to delete it if they request it, to allow them to withdraw from service if they request it. These are significant technical challenges. And yet, they must be addressed. And I truly believe, as Morel said this morning, that actually this is about good information and data governance. Having great data governance leads to better systems, leads to better results, and in the end, leads to a better return on the investment that you make in the technology. So, there are a number of impacts that our clients are challenged by. So we've talked about the issue of consent and withdrawal and deletion. I won't dwell there. We've spent a lot of time talking about automated decision making. You know, as I said at the beginning, for me, responsible AI is retaining human centricity. So this shouldn't be just about what GDPR tells us, but sensibly. If we're at the other end of a mortgage application or a query about our health insurance or our pensions or any other number of important decisions, I think most of us would like to think that somewhere in that machine, a human was either supervising or involved, and that when I have an issue, I can get to that. That computer says no idea, which Little Britain fans will remember, that is not something that consumers will be willing to, I think, contend with, and will vote with their feet if they have the opportunity. The question is in those areas where there is no choice for consumers, and I think that that is a significant concern. Working with third parties, the issue that Jonathan spoke to, I think, is one that's incredibly challenging for businesses. I can speak to Accenture's own experience. We've had to reappraise the position with thousands of business partners and partners in our ecosystem. And we have been trying to do that with risk approaches, looking at what we need to do from a documentation perspective. But the biggest part of the effort has, in many cases, been educating our third-party suppliers, that need for training and explanation, but also to try and help those suppliers understand these are not just documentation needs, but we need them to operate differently, is a fundamental challenge, and one that I think is continuing to be a challenge for businesses. Training, again, around your HR folks, your call center operatives, if you have them, a field force of sales people on the ground. It goes beyond educating the technologists who design the technology in the first place. This need to train, as a practical matter, these folks who have direct contact with your consumers or your employees is a fundamental challenge. And it is something that, of course, a data protection officer in a very large organization can be part of the spearhead and the public face of that. But every call center operative, every salesperson, every HR person is a representative of the enterprise and needs to understand how GDPR impacts what they're doing and impacts the business operation. And I'd like to touch on this subject of innovation, because I absolutely agree with Jonathan that at the heart of many businesses is this question around how do you drive innovation? How do you make innovation come to life? And frankly, as an organization who drives a digital business that talks about we want to change the way the world works and lives for the better, I think that that's incredibly important. And I think what the GDPR does about impact assessments is a great start. What it does is it shows a method of thinking about the way in which technology and innovation is developed, be it innovation, frankly, in processes or innovation in technology, that allows us to think differently about how do we assess the consequences? How do we try and have foresight, if you like, of the impact of what we are proposing to do? But it is just a first step. Ultimately, I think as was suggested in the very first session, we have to have a continuing and sustained program where we look not just at that first blush, this is our idea, this is what we're going to build, but we continually assess over a period of years what is happening with the technology. Have we changed our purposes slightly in a nuanced way without perhaps thinking about it? Are we changing the way we give access? Are we changing the way we collect perhaps other data? These questions need to be reassessed and reassessed on a regular basis. Otherwise, all the impact assessments is an initial view as to the technology and not part of a sustainable culture within the organization to tackle the technology or the process properly. And I think this question of how you move from thinking about GDPR as something to which you try to comply in this first instance, heading towards the deadline, to how do you bring into your enterprise a real culture of compliance? How do you make that come to life? A data protection officer isn't going to achieve that on their own. accountability models require us to really think, and it's wonderful, I think, that GDPR does now explicitly talk about accountability in a way that the data protection did not. But accountability requires us to do more than simply document our processes, simply document and have artifacts of compliance. It requires us to genuinely have that leadership buy-in at a corporate level to really have data protection be at the heart of what we do and how we do it. Now, I would like to see, and we're doing some research with the Centre of Information Policy and Law around this question of accountability. And we would really like to see how, between business, policymakers and regulators, we can look at this question of accountability and really ask, how do we incentivize organizations to truly embed accountability from the top leadership in the organization right the way through? Because with that focus and incentivizing accountability, then I think we will really drive cultures of compliance and not just legislative frameworks in order to be complied with. And I think, we could look at what the incentives might be. What kinds of incentives might be relevant to businesses, depending perhaps on their size or interests. I think issues around not just, is this a mitigating factor in the case of enforcement, but looking at things like data transfer. Can we have enterprises who truly demonstrate, not just through internal assessment, but perhaps through connection through external body assessments? We, for example, have our client data protection program is one of the only BSI certified standards. That's a program we run internally for how we handle data. That external verification should, I think, that evidence that we're able to prove around accountability, I would hope if we incentivize entities to do that, perhaps there's some benefit around data transfer that should be looked at. Perhaps there's some benefit around access to data that is driven by actually being able to demonstrate, not just through some internal assessment, but some external validation that shows that there is a real benefit and return on investment, if you like, if I put it that way, to accountability models. So I'm going to really wrap up now. Adrian knows I have a bad habit of slightly going over at these sessions. So I'm going to very quickly wrap up to say, I think, to ground this again in GDPR, we absolutely think the themes in GDPR, if you link them to this idea of customer trust, data governance, which I think has been talked to at length, and reducing risk and managing risk for the enterprise, really are an enabler for businesses, an enabler of growth and of value. And that is something that we are talking constantly to our clients about. And really, for me, the question is, in this next phase of GDPR, how do we really help businesses as they struggle with moving from the initial stages of compliance to really creating a really sustained culture of compliance that must really be at the heart of their business and really at the heart of their relationship with their customers and consumers. Thank you.